AI is changing the world and making a lot of us pretty nervous. Are the headlines about mass job losses true, or is the future brighter than we think? We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more right now on UBS Trending. Hi, everybody, and welcome to UBS Trending. I'm Anthony Pastore. Thanks for joining me. In the studio to have this conversation on AI and jobs is Andrew Dubinsky, economist with the Chief Investment Office here at UBS. Andrew, nice to have you in the studio. Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Glad we could have this conversation.
Yeah, me too. You know, you just recently wrote a report that I found really intriguing titled AI Job Anxiety versus Reality. So we said, let's get Andrew here because this is a topic that I think is really happening more and more of. Even this past weekend, I was with friends and AI as just a concept kept coming up and people were worried about, oh, is this going to be a job killer? Are humans going to be out of work? What's going to happen as that future down the road looks like AI is doing a lot of our jobs? So the question is, through your research, just from a top kind of macro level, what are you seeing when it comes to this fear, this anxiety about AI taking our jobs?
Yeah, so we're all seeing these pretty gloomy headlines, and I think that's influencing a lot of how we think about it. Mm-hmm. And there's also a lot of research that shows that a lot of occupations have a pretty high exposure to AI, high enough that there could be some risk of automation. So there's this number that's been kicked around by a couple of researchers that, around a quarter of jobs are at risk of automation at some point. And if you look at different occupations, one of the things that pops up is that jobs that and occupations that tend to have higher educational attainment, jobs that require a college degree, they tend to have more exposure. And this kind of goes away against the way we typically think about job safety, that having more education would protect you. But in this case, there's more exposure that comes with jobs that have more education associated with it. So I think it definitely makes sense that there's anxiety associated with this phenomenon.
Yeah, that chart that we have up there, the first and the highest column on the left-hand side is computer/math, which I think most people would say, well, that makes sense because AI can do complicated calculations and computations, but then you look at the rest of it, and there is some exposure here and there, and obviously the idea of more educated individuals being more exposed to AI job losses is very interesting to me. So that kind of takes me, so here's the thing. This AI anxiety, could it potentially become, maybe this is a pretty existential question, but could it become a drag on the economy, like by slowing adoption or even influencing policy, things that could really add that fear component into general growth?
Yeah, I think in our base case, and given the adoption trends that we're seeing right now, we think of AI as generally a net positive for growth. And the way, obviously right now we see a lot of investment, and that's contributing to growth. And eventually we think that it adds to productivity, and that just means there's more spending, and that in turn would add more income for other people to spend and more hiring. But there are some scenarios that we worry about where the adoption is a bit too fast. And we think about this analogy that economists often use for the unemployment rate. It's called the bathtub analogy. And the analogy is, a bathtub, has a level of water, and that's, there's a number of people that are unemployed, and the faucet is adding new people to the pool of unemployed. Either they joined the labor market or they lost their job, and the drain is removing the unemployed because they've gotten a new job, or maybe they've retired, and so the bathtub can stay in a certain equilibrium where it doesn't overflow. And I would say where we are right now with the bathtub is maybe AI is lifting the level of the tub a little bit. But in general, there's people that are able to find new work, and so the unemployment rate's not really moving that much. People are also calling this a low hire, low fire economy. So that's where there's not a lot of water coming in and not a lot of water leaving. And I think the concern is that AI would be disruptive enough where the faucet just adds too many people to the bathtub, and it overflows because people just can't find a job that fits their existing skills. So there's some concerns that we're going to get new jobs, new occupations, but maybe people aren't really well suited for them right away. So there's got to be a way for them to kind of find a way to transition to those new roles.
Right, it's not an overnight phenomenon. It's, if you go back to even the Industrial Revolution, when factories were opening up and automating a lot of work that people were doing by hand, it wasn't that they were losing their jobs of doing it by hand, but they were learning how to work within the machines, within the factories. So that created a whole new series of jobs. Obviously, this is something that we've talked about a lot when it comes to AI, but even the dot-com tech explosion back in the 90s and early 2000s tells us. So looking at history, how does that fit today? Because it is a little bit different with AI, as you just said. The more educated folks, they're the ones who have maybe their jobs more at risk. There's a little bit of a difference there, but how does history tell you about what's happening now?
Right. So history is definitely a useful guide here in the sense that we have a lot of our prior innovation booms to look at. And the way economists quantify innovation is they use this concept of productivity. Just how much GDP are you generating per hour, per worker hour? And what you've seen historically is that when you've had an acceleration of productivity, you've actually seen a corresponding increase in compensation rates. So that is, the number of hours people are working and how much wages adjusted for inflation are they getting. And it tends to be actually, I would say, a benign environment for workers. And if we go back to like the mid to late 90s example that you're referring to and I'm looking at, productivity growth was around 2.5%. And that's, let's say, about 1% higher than what we saw after the GFC. So a pretty high rate of productivity. And then you also had compensation growth in that environment of over 4%. So it's also a pretty good environment for wages. So you have a recent example, pretty disruptive. It came with a lot of new occupations, video game programmers, influencers, but even in that period of time where it was being quite disruptive, it was not bad for labor and for workers.
Yeah. That's a great example, by the way. I love that part of it. And by the way, I keep thinking about low hire, low fire when you were talking about the bathtub analogy. It really kind of sets up exactly what you're trying to get at in your report, because it is true that the headlines they're very scary. I mean, even the Pope is coming out on television and talking about the dangers of AI.
Right.
But not that I'm saying that the Pope isn't justified in saying what he feels is respectful to say, but your research shows that maybe it is a little bit of hype as far as the fear. So, because you expect about 2% growth,
right.
This year, supported by AI-driven investment. So, talk about the investment side that gives you kind of that. Hey, listen, this is a really good opportunity if you want to get into the investing side of the AI story.
Yeah. So I think the way we're looking at it right now is AI is still very much a net positive. In the sense that it is contributing to the growth backdrop. I mean, we have a lot of equipment spending that's linked to it, a lot of structure spending linked to data centers, and even data centers are generating extra job growth. So there are definitely some pretty gloomy headlines. There's an expression, if it bleeds, it leads. So this is definitely an environment where the layoffs associated with AI are pretty concerning. And I think there are definitely some scenarios that we talked about that are pretty concerning. But right now, it looks like when we think about the next 12 months, it's clearly a net positive. We don't see it as being something that causes a big change in the unemployment rate and something that really derails our key investing themes.
Excellent. Andrew, thank you. It obviously is a very topical conversation because I'm literally having conversations with coworkers. I'm sure you are as well, with friends, about AI and its exponential growth. So I know this is one of those conversations that we'll have to come back to over and over again as things continue to grow and change. But thanks for talking us through and maybe taking some of that anxiety out of maybe the fear that people feel right now.
No, it's my pleasure. And you're right. It's just something we have to monitor in the sense of maybe the adoption changes in a way where maybe the anxiety does feel a little bit more justified.
Right. Great. Andrew, thank you very much. Andrew Dubinsky from the Chief Investment Office. And thank you all for joining us. There's lots more information from Andrew and the rest of the team at ubs.com/views. Plus, you can follow UBS on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook. Plus, the studio has a dedicated channel on Instagram. Follow us at UBS Trending. And as always, if you have any questions about your portfolio or anything that Andrew and I spoke about today, please make sure you're continuing this conversation with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Have a great rest of your day. And remember to keep your eyes on what's trending. We'll see you soon, everybody.